Algebra 2 Part 2. This is the second day of 821. So we're still solving quadratic equations by completing the square. And in this day today we're adding another wrinkle and doing a few examples that are a little bit more challenging. The process is still going to be the same, but there's one step that we're going to have to pay closer attention to. In all of the examples that we're doing today, the a term, which is the coefficient on your first term or your squared term, will not be 1. And so we really will have to divide by it. So it won't be 1, it could be some number like 2, 3, 4, 5, whatever. So when we do divide by it, it will change our numbers. So we actually will have to do that today. So today, but everything else is going to stay the same. So we'll jump right into the classwork and do these examples. So for number 1, we have 3x squared plus 2x minus 1 is 0. Okay, so our first step is to move the c term to the other side, and so I get 3x squared plus 2x is 1. And then what we would do is divide by our a term, so our a term is 3, and everything gets divided by it, so that's going to give us x squared plus 2/3 x, which is 1/3. And now we're going to figure out our b over 2 squared. Okay, so your b term for this particular problem, well, remember b is the coefficient in front of your variable with an exponent of 1, so our b term is going to be 2/3. So we would be doing 2/3. Now, b is a fraction, and you're doing something divided by 2. So you would be doing 2/3 divided by 2 over 1, the whole thing squared, which is the same thing as 2/3 times, if we multiply by the reciprocal, change the division sign to multiplication, times 1 over 2, the whole thing squared. And so what happens is, well, we can cancel on our diagonal, and the 2's cancel, and so then you're left with 1/3, the whole thing squared. And we're going to use the 1/3 when we go ahead and factor in a minute, and 1/3 squared is 1/9. So then we add 1/9 to both sides of the problem. So we get x squared plus 2/3 x plus 1/9 equals 1/3 plus 1/9. Okay, now at this point, what we would do is, let's probably simplify the 1/3 plus 1/9, and so we can put that all over a common denominator. Common denominator between 3 and 9 is 9, so this is the same thing as, well, 1/3 is the same thing as 3 over 9, and then you still have 1 over 9, right? So then we're still going to have x squared plus 2/3 x plus 1/9 is equal to, well, 3 plus 1 is 4, 4/9. Okay, so we'll move on to another piece of paper. Copy that over on another piece of paper. Let's see. So I have x squared plus 2/3 x plus 1/9 is 4/9. Okay, now at this point, this is when we would factor the left side, and you might be looking at this and being like, oh gosh, fractions, how the heck do I factor that? It doesn't matter how we factor it, we already have the answer, because if we go back to what we were doing when we figured out b over 3 squared, remember, whatever this number is right here before you square it with the star underneath is what you use when you factor. So we got a 1/3, so that's going to be what we use when we go ahead and factor. So what I'll get is, this will turn into x plus 1/3, the whole thing squared, is 4 over 9. Okay, so I still, even though it was a fraction, I still just threw that number in right there. So I'm going to go ahead and take the square root of both sides. Okay, so on the left, I'll get x plus 1/3, and then on the right, I'll get plus or minus, and then the square root of 4 is going to be 2, and then the square root of 9 is going to be 3. So then this turns into two separate equations that I'll have to solve. So I've got x plus 1/3 is a positive 2/3, and I have x plus 1/3 is a negative 2/3. Okay, so I'll subtract 1/3 from both sides, and on the left equation I'll get, well, 2/3 minus 1/3 is just 1/3, so x is 1/3. That's one solution. And then over here I can minus 1/3. So then over here, well, x is going to equal, whoops, I should say 1/3. So negative 2/3 minus 1/3, that's negative 3/3, which is the same thing as negative 1. So your two solutions are 1/3 and negative 1. Alright, let's try out the next problem, which is numbered as 15. So we kind of skip around for these examples today, but that's okay. So looking at 15, I have 2y squared minus 3y plus 1 is 0. Okay, so first thing, move the c term. So I'm going to get 2y squared minus 3y is negative 1. And then we'll divide everything by our a term of 2. So that gives me y squared minus 3/2 y is negative 1/2. Now I'm going to figure out b over 2 squared, right? Which, if it helps you when you have fractions in these types of problems, you could think about that as b divided by 2 squared. Sometimes it's a better way to work with it when you have fractions like this. So this, our b for this problem is negative 3/2. So I'm going to have negative 3/2 divided by 2 over 1, which is going to turn into, let's see, negative 3/2. Division turns to multiplication times 1 over 2 squared. Okay? And then if I kick this down here, so that's going to be negative 3 over 4, the whole thing squared. And remember, this negative 3 over 4, I'll put a red star next to it. We're going to use that later when we go ahead and factor. So negative 3 over 4 squared is going to be a positive 9 over 16. So that 9 over 16 we'll have to add to both sides. So I'm going to take this piece here, bring it up here, and this 9 over 16, and we'll bring it up here. And we have to add the 9 over 16 to both sides of that. So I'll have y squared minus 3/2 y. Whoops. Let's see, let's shift this down a little. Plus 9 over 16 is negative 1/2 plus 9 over 16. Okay, so we've got y squared minus 3/2 y plus 9 over 16. Now, negative 1/2 plus 9 over 16, we want to have the same denominator. So negative 1/2, let's turn that into negative 8 over 16 plus 9 over 16. So then this is going to turn into 1 over 16. So what I have is y squared minus 3/2 y plus 9 over 16 is a positive 1 over 16. Now, I can factor the left, and to factor it, I'm going to use this b that I figured out over here, negative 3/4. So this is going to turn into y minus 3/4, the whole thing squared, is equal to 1 over 16. And then I take the square root of both sides. Okay, so the square root of the left is just y minus 3/4, and then the square root of the right is plus or minus, not 1 over 16, sorry, plus or minus 1 over 4, right? The square root of 1 is 1, and the square root of 16 is 4. So then this turns into two equations. I have y minus 3/4 is a positive 1/4, and y minus 3/4 is a negative 1/4, right? So because I have that plus or minus here, I have to write the two separate equations. So I'm going to solve this equation on the left, and I can add 3/4 to both sides. Okay, and then I'll do this in red just so it doesn't get jumbled up with everything. So then the answer that I get over here, well, 1/4 plus 3/4 is 4/4, which is going to be 1. Okay, And then on the other side, well, I would also add 3/4. So then for this particular equation, I would have negative 1/4 plus 3/4. Let's see, negative 1 plus 3. That's going to give me 2/4, which is 1/2. Okay, so your two solutions here are 1 and 1/2. Okay, so I'll just write this up here a little bit clearer where we have space. Y is 1 and 1/2. Okay. So let's go ahead and take a look at example 16. So for example 16, we have 2x squared minus 5x minus 12 is 0. Okay, so I move my c term to the other side, so I add 12, and then I have 2x squared minus 5x is 12. And then I'm going to divide everything by my a term of 2, so I'll get x squared minus 5/2 x equals 6. And now I'm going to figure out b divided by 2 squared, which is going to be negative 5/2 divided by 2/1 squared, which is going to turn into negative 5/2 times 1/2, the whole thing squared, right? Because I'm dividing by a fraction, I just change that to multiplying by the reciprocal. So this will turn into negative 5/4 squared, and that negative 5/4, I'm going to use that in a moment when I factor. And so if I square that, I'll get a positive 25/16. So that 25/16 I'll have to add to both sides. Okay, so I'm going to take this part of the equation and this 25/16, and I'm going to come down here and I'll add that 25/16 to both sides. So what I'll get is x squared minus 5/2 x plus 25/16 equals 6 plus 25/16. Okay, now we want to simplify this 6 plus 25/16. Well, if we find a common denominator, that would be 16, and 16 times 6 is going to be 96. So let's see, this piece right here is the same thing as 96/16 plus 25/16, and 96 plus 25 is 121. Okay, so we could kick all of this up here and rewrite our equation as x squared minus 5/2 x plus 25/16 equals 121/16. Now we can factor the left, and to factor the left, we're going to use this negative 5/4 that we figured out a few minutes ago. So the left factors into x minus 5/4, the whole thing squared, and then the right is still just 121/16. So now we can take the square root of both sides, okay, so on the left we'll have x minus 5/4, and then on the right we'll have plus or minus, well, the square root of 121 is 11, and the square root of 16 is 4. So now we have two equations. So I have x minus 5/4 is positive 11/4, and x minus 5/4 is negative 11/4. So we'll add 5/4 to both sides, and so x is going to equal, let's see, 11 plus 5, 16/4, which is the same thing as 4. We add 5/4 over here, and so let's see, negative 11 plus 5, that's going to be negative 6/4, which is negative 3/2. Okay, so your two answers to this problem are x equals 4 and x equals negative 3 over 2. So that was number 16. So moving on to, let's see, well, we have this next problem numbered as 25. So 25 looks different than some of the other ones we've seen. So we have 2x squared equals 10 minus x. So for this one, it's not in standard form. So we've got a few things on the other side of the equal sign. All the problems we've seen so far have been set equal to 0, and this one's not. Now, so we're going to have to get do a little work to get it the way we want to start the problem off. Now, you know that the first step in all of these is moving your c term over. And your c term is your constant term, or just your number without any variable attached to it. So for this particular problem, we already have the c term on the other side of the equal sign. So the only thing that we really have to move back to with the 2x squared is this negative x. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to add x to both sides. So then that'll give me 2x squared plus x equals 10. Okay, and so you remember your first step is to move your c term or your constant term over. Well, our 10 is already on this side by itself, so we're in good shape. Okay, so now we're going to divide by our a term of 2, and so that's going to give me x squared plus 1/2 x equals 5. And so now we're going to figure out our b divided by 2 squared, and our b term is 1/2, so I'm going to have 1/2 divided by 2 over 1, which is the same thing as 1/2 times 1/2, right? I just take that 2 over 1 and flip it. So that's going to give me 1/4, the whole thing squared, which is going to be, oh, and wait a second, 1/4, put a star under that. We're going to use that in a few minutes when we factor. So 1/4 squared is going to be 1 over 16. And so 1 over 16, we'll add that to both sides of the equation. So we're going to take this step here and this 1 over 16, and we'll bring them down here, right? And so I'm going to have x squared plus 1/2 x, right? And then we'll add 1 over 16 to both sides. So I have 5 over 1 plus 1 over 16. Let's kick this up here, right? So I'll have x squared plus 1/2 x plus 1 over 16. Now, this 5 plus 1 over 16, we want to have the same denominator. So let's have a denominator of 16. So 5 times 16 is 80. So I'll have, let's see, 80 over 16 plus 1 over 16. So let's see, x squared plus 1/2 x plus 1 over 16. Okay, we're going to simplify the right side. That's just going to turn into 81 over 16. So now I can factor the left, and to factor that, we're going to use this 1/4 over here that we starred. So this is going to turn into x plus 1/4, the whole thing squared. That equals 81 over 16. So now we can take the square root of both sides. Alright, and so the square root of the left is just x plus 1 over 4, and then the square root of the right is going to be plus or minus 9 over 4. So let's see, I'm going to have, so we'll turn this into two equations. I'll have x plus 1 over 4 is a positive 9 over 4, and x minus 1 over 4 is also a positive, is a negative 9 over 4. So positive version, negative version. Whoops, that should be a plus. Okay, so I made a few mistakes. Let me clarify. This x plus 1 over 4, that stays the same. So I have x plus 1 over 4, x plus 1 over 4. The sign that changes is what's in front of 9 over 4, right? So positive 9 over 4, negative 9 over 4. Alright, so now I'm going to subtract 1 over 4 from both sides. So I'll get x is, and then 9 minus 1 is 8. So 8 over 4, which is 2. Subtract 1 over 4 over here. And then x is, well, negative 9 minus 1 is negative 10 over 4, which is negative 5 over 2. So your two solutions are x is 2 and x is negative 5 over 2. So that's 25. So the last one that we have to do is 26. So for 26, I have x plus 3 times x minus 1 equals x minus 2. So this doesn't look like anything we've done so far. And so what we're going to have to do is FOIL that all out and get it to look like a quadratic. We're going to have to do the actual work to get it to look like a quadratic before we can complete the square. Okay, so if we FOIL the left, we'll get x squared minus x plus 3x minus 3, and that equals our right, which is x minus 2. Okay, so simplifying the left, let's see, we'll have x squared negative 1x plus 3x. Let's see, that'll be a plus 2x, right? So negative 1 plus 3, yeah, that's positive 2. And then we have minus 3 equals x minus 2. Okay, so we want to start off with this set equal to 0. So minus x plus 2 plus 2. So that'll give me x squared plus x, and then negative 3 plus 2, that's minus 1, and that all equals 0. Okay, so now this looks like the kind of stuff that we did yesterday. So we can just go ahead and move our c term to the other side. So add 1, add 1. So x squared plus x is 1. So now we're going to do b divided by 2 squared. So that's going to be 1 over 2, the whole thing squared. And well, 1 over 2, that's as far as we can simplify that. And we'll use that in a moment when we factor. And 1 over 2 squared is going to be 1 over 4. Okay? So 1 over 4 we're going to add to both sides. So we'll take this piece here and this here, and we'll bring it up here, and I'll get x squared plus x plus 1 over 4 is 1 plus 1 over 4. So I added that to both sides. So we can simplify our right. Well, 1 plus 1 over 4, well, 1 is the same thing as 4 over 4, right? So I'm doing 4 over 4 plus 1 over 4, which is going to be 5 over 4, okay? So then on the left, we still have x squared plus x plus 1 over 4, and that all equals 5 over 4. So we can go ahead and factor the left, and to factor this, we're just going to use this 1/2 that we figured out down here when we did our b over 2 squared. So we'll have x plus 1/2, the whole thing squared, is 5 over 4. Let's take the square root of both sides. Okay, so on the left we'll get x plus 1 over 1/2, and then on the 1 over 2 rather, and then on the right, well, we can't take the square root of 5, so we'll leave that like that. We can take the square root of 4, that's 2. And then because we can't simplify the 5, so throw in that plus or minus. Okay, so now we can't simplify the 5, so this is kind of as far as we can go, the plus or minus root 5 over 2. And so then our last step is to just subtract 1/2. So we have x equals plus or minus root 5 over 2, excuse me, minus 1/2. So we would really like to write this with our rational number first. So let's change this and say that this is x is, oh, I'm running out of room. Let's see, I'll do this down here. X is negative 1/2 plus or minus the square root of 5 over 2. And so this is your answer, and that's as simple as you can get it. Okay, so we did some more challenging problems for completing the square, and so I hope you feel confident enough to try the homework on your own.